Good afternoon, Jeremy. I am here with Jeremy Shapiro, the day of our War and Peace conference to which you participated, and we had very lively discussion on the state of geopolitics in Europe, of course, after the Ukraine invasion and what does it mean for world order. Jeremy Shapiro, you are the research director of the European Council on Foreign Relations, a long-standing friend of CIDOB and a prominent figure of the think tank community across Europe. So
I like to think so, yeah.
Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And for having the opportunity to discuss a bit more in detail what some of the aspects that we tackled during our War and Peace conference. Something that I wanted to start our conversation on is on the concept on which you've been working for a long time at ECFR on European sovereignty.
Yeah.
Of course, European sovereignty speaks to the need for the EU to play a more geopolitical role, to have a stronger stance in international affairs, also due to the changes at the global level and the reordering of international relations, the rise of other powers that want to challenge current order structures and norms and ideas. How do you think the war in Ukraine, the Russian aggression, the state of the renewed transatlantic alliance is changing the concept of European sovereignty?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm tempted to sort of use the usual sort of chew and lie punt and say, well, it's too soon to tell. But I sense that that's probably not an adequate answer for this forum. To my mind, I think it does cut in two different directions. I mean, in the first and the sort of most, the clearest way of looking at it is that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a sort of demonstration of a point that we were making a lot in the European sovereignty work, that the world is becoming much more rife with geopolitical competition, and that if the EU and European member states want to have a voice in that world, they're going to have to engage in that geopolitical competition. They're going to have to think more geopolitically. They're going to have to develop in a bunch of different issue areas the independent capacity to act. I think that the Russia-Ukraine war has demonstrated that in spades, and I think actually Europeans have broadly recognized that, and we can see a degree of geopolitical action on the part of the Europeans that is quite impressive by EU standards. By the way, not impressive by anybody else's standards, but nonetheless, you know, I think I would have said 3 weeks ago before the war started that Europeans hadn't progressed very far in European sovereignty, and I think actually they've progressed further since the war began than they had in the previous several years.
The question is autonomy, which is another word that is traditionally used along the lines of European sovereignty. Can Europe be autonomous? Can it develop strategic autonomy?
Yeah, that's sort of where I was going with that. I think that at the same time that the Russia-Ukraine crisis has demonstrated that Europe needs to be more sovereign, and that Europe has accepted that the need for geopolitical orientation, it has also both reduced the incentive and the necessity of being autonomous particularly from the United States. And there is in this crisis, I think we see it very strongly, a sort of lapsing back into the old Cold War habits, whereby the United States essentially organized the security of Europe, and Europeans participated in that, had some voice, but broadly speaking, the United States made most of the decisions and provided most of the resources. And that, I think that is a model which both the US and European leaders in this crisis, because in fact they had very little choice, have quite easily lapsed back into, that for the Americans it's sort of natural, and for the Europeans they just feel like there's no other choice, there's no other leader in Europe that could organize that. The Americans are what helped them to decide what to do and to help them maintain their own unity. And so I can't really blame them for that in this particular crisis, but I do think it cuts against the developing European approach, which is to say we have to have a autonomous capacity because the Americans are becoming less interested in Europe because of their focus on China, and becoming less reliable as an ally because of the domestic politics in the United States and the very let's say, untransatlantic opinions of the Trumpian Republican Party, which remains a very clear and present threat in U.S. domestic politics.
Before we unfold the idea of strategic autonomy or European sovereignty into different areas where the EU could act more promisingly, I wanted to ask whether you think that the alliance and the strategic thinking that has brought Europeans together as a consequence of the Ukraine crisis will last for a long time, or you would see these more strategic divisions that have always been there when it comes to relations with Russia or on many of the topics of the international agenda, if these divergences will again emerge sometime soon, and when they do, if we will be again confronted to the more traditional discussions we have on European foreign policy between the capability expectations gap. We want the Europeans to do a lot, but at the end of the day, they don't have the capabilities. They're divided. Yeah. They don't have the right institutional framing for doing the. Will that be again a feature of our conversations? Not, in a short time period.
It's always the best prediction to predict that that things will go back to what they were, and that arguments will recur, because it feels like, particularly in Europe, arguments never really end. So I guess I do think that the unity that Vladimir Putin has provided to Europe in the last few weeks is, I won't say that it's fleeting, but it is bounded. And I think, as and when the Ukraine war winds down, or just sort of reaches some sort of nightmare stasis even, that divides will open up within Europe. I think that's just natural in any large conglomeration of countries. And I think I see, and those divides, by the way, will open both within Europe and across the transatlantic partners. And I see two principal ways that we should expect those things to happen as we reach some sort of unstable stability in Ukraine. The first is that I think that there will be a real divide on how to deal with Russia afterwards. I think that there is, you hear it already, we heard it in our conference today, there is a view in the eastern part of Europe that we're already at war with Russia. And that Russia is so, or at least this Russian regime, I should say, is so inherently aggressive that there isn't really any possibility of negotiation with them. And so we should recognize that fact and, in essence, use this crisis or whatever opportunity we have to bow to that inevitable and have that conflict with Russia, so because it's more favorable to us now than it would be at some other point. And I think that that's a very strong position across most of Eastern Europe and Poland and the Baltic states. I think we heard that today, although not quite explicitly. And I think that that's not a position that the Westerners or the United States is likely to hold anytime soon. And they will be of the view that that although Russia has clearly violated a lot of international norms, we don't have either the interest or the need to change the regime in Russia and to risk a wider war with Russia. I think that's going to become a sort of persistent divide. Frankly, it was before this war, but it's going to become sharper afterwards. And the fact of the war and the fact of the mobilization has diminished that divide for a while. I think the second divide that I see reopening is a sort of transatlantic one, and this is going to be a question of priorities, really. The U.S. is going to still view the Chinese problem as a bigger problem than the Russian problem once this crisis subsides a little bit, and they're really going to be thinking about. Well, let me sort of do a historical analogy. In World War II, the Americans were attacked by the Japanese and declared a Europe First strategy, and the reason they did that is because they felt like, even though the Japanese were in some sense the immediate cause of the war, the Germans were a more serious problem, and they had to devote as a priority their resources to the German problem. That was tricky in public relations. That was a big problem for the American administration, but they did it. They managed it. I think they're probably likely to try and succeed at a similar task, which is, even though the Russians have been clearly the ones that disrupted the international system here, the Americans are going to make a case that they need to be, as a priority, devoting resources and efforts to the Chinese problem. And the Europeans are not going to agree. They're going to want to devote as a priority, even though they're going to agree that China is a problem, they're going to want as a priority to devote resources and attention to the Russian problem. And that, to me, gets back to our European sovereignty, European autonomy. If the Europeans want, if the Europeans want to be able to focus on what matters to them, which will fundamentally be Russia, they're going to have to bring autonomous capabilities to the table. Otherwise, they'll be constantly having that argument with the Americans, but they'll also constantly be losing it.
Yeah. Let me go back. You mentioned it again on European sovereignty discussions. Or at least when we speak about strategic autonomy, we talk a lot about defense and security and defense components. And that, of course, is another source of conflict among member states when it comes to relations with NATO, who is the main security provider. And that is a very problematic historical rift within the European Union. And perhaps we've been talking too much when we refer to strategic autonomy precisely to the security and defense component, at least until today, until war in Ukraine. And now we've seen precisely NATO gaining a stronger role and the US gaining a stronger role in that security and defense component in Europe. Beyond that area, beyond security and defense, what other areas you think that we should take into account when we speak about the broader agenda for European sovereignty or for strategic autonomy, call it as you like?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I should say that at ECFR, when we started looking at this question 3 or 4 years ago, we thought that security and defense was the single most important area, and I think we still see that, but we thought that it was actually shouldn't be and can't be limited to that, particularly in the modern world. What we were seeing was a geopolitical competition emerging in which states were weaponizing every area of every channel of interdependence. And so that the conflict would extend across multiple issue areas and would require a geopolitical approach in a lot of different issue areas well beyond security and defense. So we created a pentagon of sovereignty. It was unfortunate there were 5 because that sounds like the Pentagon, but that's not what we meant. So security and defense is one, but the other 4 are climate, health, technology, and broadly speaking, economics. And I think you can see all of these areas being weaponized for geopolitical competition in the last several years. I think the economics realm is a particularly interesting one. This way in which states are using economic coercion in order to secure geopolitical gains. We saw even the Trump administration do that to Europe in its first term. We're seeing the Chinese attempt to do that with Lithuania right now. We're seeing the Russians at least contemplating doing it in the energy realm. And this capacity to weaponize economic links and use asymmetric dependencies and supply chains to create geopolitical advantage, it seems to me, is very much the way of the modern world. I think in health, we saw it during the pandemic, where it was access to health supplies and Chinese efforts to use its dominance in PPE, personal protective equipment, for geopolitical purposes, and of course the American vaccine and European vaccine diplomacy. And climate, I think we could tell a similar story about countries trying to weaponize that. So I think all of these areas are super important. I think Europe has had varying success in the different areas. What seems to me to be an important sort of common thread that has been revealed by the Russia-Ukraine crisis, but I think was true before that, is that it's important for Europeans to be able to think geopolitically in these areas, to recognize that, as Trotsky said, you may not be interested in the revolution, but the revolution is interested in you, and that if Europeans are not competing geopolitically in each of these areas, then they're losing.
Mm-hmm. And geopolitics will be interested
in them.
In them, right. the challenge is coherence, right? I mean, the challenge for this is, yes, the scope of the aspects in which you need to act geopolitically is expanding. How do you make sure that your system, institutional system, and the way that the EU functions makes the use of all these tools in a coherent manner, or at least coherent enough to play a geopolitical role?
I mean, I think that that's a super difficult problem, and it's particularly difficult for the EU system of governance, which is actually specifically set up not to do this. I mean, on a certain level, the entire point of the EU was to depoliticize certain technical issue areas and to take them out of the realm of politics, or at least geopolitics. And you can see that, like, for example, the trade. Trade is, a geopolitical weapon that's used by pretty much every country on earth if they can. And in Europe, there is this dogma that trade shouldn't be a geopolitical weapon. And the institutional setup reflects that. They have this very independent trade organization at the supranational level whose mandate and culture is very focused on getting trade deals, not on using trade as a weapon to secure other, like say, better human rights or concessions on Ukraine or something like that. It's actually constitutionally, culturally opposed to that kind of thing. So clearly, what you need is both on the EU level and on the member state level, is a capacity to integrate policy across issue areas and to be able to inject the geopolitical considerations into what have historically been viewed as technical areas. I think that that's a big bureaucratic challenge, even a cultural challenge for the governance organizations. But intriguingly, I think it's also, first, a conceptual challenge. First, you have to decide that you want to do that. I would say even a year ago that Europeans, by and large, hadn't decided to do that. They were getting there, I think. Maybe when von der Leyen came in and declared that 2 years ago, she declared that her commission would be a geopolitical commission. I think she was saying, I've decided to do this. But I think if you look at what she was actually able to accomplish in the commission, she hadn't succeeded in orienting the entire commission in that way. I think that there's some chance that that will change in the fairly near future because the conceptual groundwork has been laid, lots of people are already there, and the Russia-Ukraine crisis has reinforced the argument. But there's quite a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I remember very well one of your papers on European sovereignty, in which precisely you put forward the idea that acting as a sovereign power in terms of Europe also requires rethinking what sovereignty means. And probably for the European Union, sovereignty was something you wanted to escape in a certain sense. In other areas, you were thinking about also escaping the logics of power and defense issues. So all this requires this change of mindset of the European Union. And then, of course, this is the first step. Second is to adapt the structures, to adapt the capacities, to adapt the policies to that change of framing. Do you see that happening anytime soon? Will it? How many years will we need for that change to happen?
I don't know. I think that the mindset change that you were just describing has largely been accomplished now, which is quite something. If you had said to me when we started the sovereignty project 3 or 4 years ago that we would have reached that point by now, I would be quite surprised. I think the governance changes are obviously lagging way behind, but the world is cooperating. I guess we always expected it to. It's generating these crises and demonstrating the geopolitical competition ever more clearly, and that's what inspires change more than think tankers spinning out papers.
We're heading
sorry to tell you that.
But no, you're right. But you put the right tone to what I was about to ask now, which is our role as think tanks.
Very important, very, very important.
Very important role because we live out of it, and that's a good reason to consider it very important. But also we've been demanded more and more to be able to, if not tell the future, at least anticipate developments. And of course we are quite poor at doing that. It's very difficult for us to know exactly what will happen. But the foresight analysis and the need to look beyond current realities is something that is increasingly in demand by public bodies, by private companies, by our stakeholders in general. How do you see that area of research, if we can call it the foresight research, useful, not useful, worth developing, or worth sticking to reality?
Yeah, no, I can't stick to reality. It's too limiting. I do think that this is a worthwhile endeavor, but I think it's important to understand what's worthwhile about it. On a certain level, it's not the predictions, even though that's what we are being asked for. Mark Leonard and I every year do a predictions exercise where we predict 10 things, 10 important geopolitical trends we think are going to happen in the next year, and then evaluate the ones that we did last year. We grade ourselves on a curve, and we grade ourselves, so we're quite generous. But the truth is, we get a lot of stuff wrong. I mean, like every year, and I don't really think that we or anyone else are particularly good at predictions. But I think that the point of making the predictions is not to be right, per se. It would be nice. The point of making the predictions is to reveal your logic, your mindset, and to be able to put down on paper. And I think that this is the responsibility that we owe the people who are asking us these questions, to put down on paper our best thinking, our best guess, and to do that with a recognition that there's a good chance that we'll be wrong, but that doesn't absolve us of the responsibility of saying what we think if we're going to make any sort of claim for expertise. And when we are wrong, as we inevitably are, I think it's important to sort of acknowledge that, but it's also important to use the record that we've created about why we got something wrong to try to examine that and to try to understand where our logic fell down, where our evidence fell down, and how we can do better next time. I think that the Russia-Ukraine crisis is a pretty good example of that. At the beginning of the year, Mark and I predicted that there would be no Russian invasion of Ukraine this year, and at least a major invasion. We predicted that the military threat would continue, but I think that the reason that we predicted that is because we did a little bit too much mirror imaging of the Russians, and we assumed that because it was our analysis that this was something that wouldn't benefit the Russians, that they would not do it. I think, frankly, events have proven us right that it's not to the benefit of the Russians to do this. Still early days, but I think that will end up being the case. But they had a different evaluation. So that points to me the need for us to understand better how the Russians see these issues, and maybe more precisely, how they evaluate the costs and benefits of an action like this. And I think that's a very difficult empirical question, but I think that the exercise of predicting and writing down on paper what we predicted at the beginning of this year has pointed us toward the necessity of doing that.
Jeremy, thank you very much. We had a very good conversation on the follow-up of our War and Peace conference, and also on the role that we can play in helping shaping the world we live in, which at the end of the day is what we look at and what we try to explain to broader audiences and provide some light to these dark times that we're living. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And see you next time.
Okay.